A few years back, a friend of mine handed me a block of wood about the size of a brick. Dark greenish brown, waxy looking, almost like it had been oiled even though he swore nobody had touched it. I turned it over in my hands, and the first thing I noticed was the weight. It felt wrong. It felt like I was holding a piece of iron that somebody had carved to look like wood. I said something like, "What is this, lead?" And he just smiled and said, "Drop it in that bucket of water over there." So I did, and it sank, straight to the bottom. No bobbing, no floating, no hesitation. It dropped like a stone. I stood there staring at it thinking, I have been working with wood for over 40 years, and I have never seen a piece of wood sink in water. Then he told me something that stopped me cold. He said the world's first nuclear submarine, the USS Nautilus, ran its propeller shaft on bearings made from that exact species of wood. Not metal, not some synthetic polymer. Wood. The same kind of wood sitting at the bottom of that bucket. That sent me down a rabbit hole I have never really come back from. And today, I want to walk you through everything I have learned about this extraordinary material, because the more you understand about it, the more it changes how you think about wood itself. Plus, stick around to the end because I will show you exactly how to tell real lignum vitae from the imposters that get sold under the same name. Let me start at the beginning. The wood is called lignum vitae. That is Latin, and it translates to wood of life. It comes from a small, slow-growing tree in the genus Guaiacum, primarily two species, Guaiacum officinale and Guaiacum sanctum. Both are native to the Caribbean, Central America, and the northern coast of South America, and both produce what is arguably the most remarkable wood that has ever grown on this planet. Let me show you why. When European explorers first encountered this tree in the late 1400s and early 1500s, they were not interested in building with it. They thought it was medicine. The indigenous Taino people of the Caribbean had been using the wood and its resin for generations to treat a variety of ailments, and the Spanish brought it back to Europe as a supposed cure for syphilis. That is actually how it got the name wood of life. They believed it could save you. Now, the medicinal claims turned out to be mostly exaggerated, but in the process of handling this wood, European shipwrights and craftsmen started noticing something far more valuable. This material had physical properties that did not exist in any other wood they had ever encountered. It was harder than anything they had in their lumber yards. It was heavier than water. It seemed to resist rot and saltwater damage almost indefinitely. And it had this strange, waxy, self-lubricating quality that made it behave less like timber and more like a natural bearing material. Over the next 4 centuries, those properties would put lignum vitae at the center of some of the most important engineering achievements in history, and it all starts with that density. When I say this wood sinks, I am not talking about barely sinking. I am talking about a specific gravity between 1.05 and 1.14. Water has a specific gravity of 1, so lignum vitae is anywhere from 5 to 14% denser than water itself. Every cell in this wood is packed so tightly that there is almost no airspace left inside it. To put that in perspective, white oak, which most of us consider a heavy, dense hardwood, has a specific gravity of about 0.68. Hard maple sits around 0.63. Even ebony, which most people think of as the heaviest wood you can buy, only comes in around 1.03. Lignum vitae is denser than all of them. Pick up a piece and you feel it immediately. It does not feel like wood. Your brain registers it as something else entirely because you have spent your whole life associating wood with a certain weight range, and this blows past that range completely. A board 1 foot long, 4 inches wide, and 1 inch thick weighs close to 2.5 pounds. That same board in white oak would weigh about 1.5 pounds. You notice the difference the instant you lift it. And what creates that density is fascinating. The grain structure is among the most tightly interlocked of any species on Earth. The fibers do not run in neat parallel lines the way they do in most lumber. They weave and cross over each other in an almost woven pattern, which is part of what makes the wood so incredibly hard and so resistant to splitting. But it also means every cubic inch is packed with more actual wood fiber than almost any other tree produces. There is simply more material per unit of volume. That is why it sinks. There is nowhere for the air to hide. Now here is where things start to get really interesting, because density alone does not explain why this wood ended up inside submarine propeller shafts and naval chronometers. What makes lignum vitae truly unique is what is hiding between those tightly packed fibers. If you cut a fresh piece of lignum vitae, the first thing you notice, even before the color, is the smell. It has a faint, resinous, almost medicinal scent, and your blade comes away with a waxy film on it. That is guaiac resin, sometimes called guaiacum, and this wood is absolutely saturated with it. Up to roughly 25 to 30% of the wood's total weight is resin, not sap, not moisture, resin, a naturally occurring waxy, self-replenishing lubricant that permeates every single cell of the heartwood. Here is what that means in practical terms. When lignum vitae is used as a bearing surface and something is spinning against it, the friction generates a small amount of heat. That heat softens the resin just slightly and it migrates to the surface. The wood literally lubricates itself. The harder it works, the more lubrication it produces. And when the friction stops, the resin cools and settles back into the grain, ready for the next cycle. Think about that for a second. Every metal bearing in the world requires external lubrication, oil, grease, something. And if that lubrication fails, you get metal on metal contact, heat buildup, and catastrophic failure. Lignum vitae cannot run out of lubricant because the lubricant is the wood itself. It is built into the cellular structure. It does not leak out. It does not evaporate. It does not need to be replenished. It just works, year after year, decade after decade. I remember the first time I planed a piece of lignum vitae. The shavings came off with this oily sheen, almost like I had waxed the blade, and the surface left behind was so smooth and so naturally polished that it looked like it had already been finished. That is the resin at work. You are not just cutting wood. You are cutting through a material that is actively trying to stay slippery. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. Alright, let us keep going. Now, let us talk about hardness, because this is where lignum vitae starts to feel less like a wood species and more like an engineering material that just happens to grow on a tree. On the Jenka hardness scale, which measures how much force it takes to embed a steel ball halfway into a piece of wood, lignum vitae registers over 4,400 pounds force. To put that in context, red oak comes in around 1,290. Hard maple is about 1,450. Even Brazilian walnut, which flooring companies love to call the hardest wood available, only hits about 3,680. Lignum vitae is in a class by itself. What does that mean in the shop? It means your saw blades dull fast. Your chisels need frequent sharpening. Drilling it feels more like drilling a dense plastic or a soft metal than drilling wood. Old shipwrights who worked with lignum vitae regularly reported that it threw sparks on the lathe. Actual sparks from wood. And remember that interlocked grain I mentioned earlier? That is a big part of why it is so hard. Because the fibers cross over each other in every direction, there is no easy path for a split to travel. You cannot split lignum vitae with a wedge the way you can split oak or ash. The interlocked grain catches and redirects any crack before it can propagate. The wood essentially holds itself together from the inside. That is also why it machines so beautifully despite its hardness. It does not chip out or tear. It cuts clean, as long as your tools are sharp enough to handle it. Now here is where everything converges, and this is the part of the story that still gives me chills. For centuries, shipwrights needed a material for one of the most demanding applications in all of engineering. The stern tube bearing. This is the sleeve that sits inside the hull of a ship where the propeller shaft passes through. The shaft spins constantly under enormous load while fully submerged in saltwater. Whatever material lines that bearing has to handle continuous friction, resist corrosion from seawater, survive marine organisms trying to colonize it, and keep working reliably for years between dry dock maintenance. Metal bearings in saltwater are a nightmare. Bronze corrodes, iron rusts. Babbitt metal wears unevenly and requires constant external lubrication, which is nearly impossible to maintain reliably in a submerged environment. But lignum vitae? It thrives in exactly these conditions. The resin makes it self-lubricating, so it does not need external oil or grease. The density and hardness mean it wears slowly and evenly. The natural resin makes it essentially impervious to rot and marine borers. And seawater actually helps the system work, because the water serves as a coolant while the resin handles the lubrication. Shipwrights figured this out centuries ago. They would cut lignum vitae into staves, arrange them end grain out in a cylindrical pattern inside the stern tube, and let the propeller shaft spin directly against the wood. The end grain presented the maximum amount of resin to the bearing surface, and the whole assembly would polish itself smooth during the first few hours of operation. By 1929, the United States Navy had compiled enough operational data to make an extraordinary claim. Their assessment stated that essentially every battleship and steamship in the world was turning its propeller shaft inside a lignum vitae bearing, not most ships, essentially all of them. And that tradition did not stop when the nuclear age arrived. In 1954, when the USS Nautilus became the first nuclear-powered submarine in history, the most advanced military vessel ever built at that time, its propeller shaft ran on lignum vitae bearings, a tropical hardwood sitting at the absolute center of a nuclear reactor-driven propulsion system. The old Shipwrights material, proven over centuries, was still the best option available, even when the power source was splitting atoms. Now, let me take you in a slightly different direction, because the Navy was not the only institution that figured out what this wood could do. In the 1700s, an English carpenter named John Harrison was trying to solve what was known as the longitude problem. Navigators at sea had no reliable way to determine their east-west position, and the key to solving it was building a clock accurate enough to keep time over months-long ocean voyages. The problem was that every clock of that era used metal gears and bearings that required oil, and oil at sea either dried out, gummed up, or changed viscosity with temperature swings. No clock could stay accurate under those conditions. Harrison's breakthrough was partly mechanical genius, but a critical part of his solution was material selection. For the bearing surfaces and several internal components of his marine chronometers, he chose lignum vitae. The self-lubricating resin meant his clocks never needed oiling. The dimensional stability of the wood meant the parts held their shape even as temperatures and humidity shifted at sea. His clocks kept time accurately enough to solve the longitude problem, and they changed the course of navigation history. And at the heart of that achievement was the same waxy, green-brown wood that would later sit inside nuclear submarines. There is something beautiful about that. 2 centuries apart, 2 completely different engineering challenges, and both solved in part by the same tree. One more property I want to cover before we move on, and it is one that most people overlook. Lignum vitae contains no silica. Now, if you have ever worked with teak or some other tropical hardwoods, you know what silica does. It is essentially microsite glass particles embedded in the wood fibers, and it destroys cutting edges. Teak eats saw blades specifically because of its silica content. You would expect a wood as dense and hard as lignum vitae to be loaded with silica, but it contains none. 0. The hardness comes entirely from the density and interlocking of the wood fibers themselves, combined with the resin. This means that while lignum vitae is tough on tools because of its sheer hardness, it does not have that abrasive, grinding quality that silica-laden woods have. Your edges dull from resistance, not from abrasion. And that distinction mattered enormously for precision applications like Harrison's chronometers, where the bearing surfaces needed to wear evenly and predictably without introducing grit into the mechanism. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years, things I used to assume myself that this wood completely overturned. The first pattern is the assumption that metal is always superior to wood for mechanical applications. I grew up believing that. If something needs to handle friction, load, and wear, you reach for metal. Period. But lignum vitae proves that a biological material can outperform engineered metals in specific conditions, especially in wet environments where corrosion is a factor. The second pattern is dismissing natural lubrication as unreliable. We trust oil because we can see it, measure it, and reapply it. The idea that a material can lubricate itself sounds like marketing, not engineering. But the guaiac resin system is not some marginal novelty. It powered the propeller shafts of the entire world's naval fleet for over a century. The third pattern is equating hardness with brittleness. In most materials, the harder something gets, the more likely it is to crack or shatter under impact. Lignum vitae breaks that rule because the interlocked grain gives it toughness to match its hardness. It is hard and flexible at the same time, which is extraordinarily rare. The fourth pattern is assuming that old solutions get replaced because better ones come along. Sometimes, the old solution is still the best one. Lignum vitae was not replaced in naval bearings because a better material was found. It was replaced primarily because the trees were being harvested to the point of endangerment. Synthetic polymer bearings took over out of necessity, not superiority. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. If you ever come across a piece of wood being sold as lignum vitae, here is exactly how to verify it. First, pick it up. If it does not feel shockingly heavy for its size, it is not lignum vitae. Your hands should immediately tell you something is different. Second, drop a small piece in water. It must sink, not slowly settle. Sink. If it floats, it is not the real thing, no matter what the seller says. Third, look at the end grain color. True lignum vitae heartwood is a deep greenish brown, sometimes almost olive, with a waxy luster that looks like the wood has already been oiled. Sapwood is a pale, sharply contrasting yellow. That color combination is distinctive. Fourth, cut or sand a small area and smell it. Genuine lignum vitae has a faint, resinous, slightly sweet medicinal scent. If it smells like nothing, or like generic tropical wood, be skeptical. And fifth, check for the oily residue on your blade. A real piece of lignum vitae will leave a visible waxy film on whatever you cut it with. That is the guaiac resin, and no imposter species replicates it convincingly. Genuine lignum vitae is increasingly rare and expensive due to its endangered status, but it can still be sourced from specialty dealers who carry certified or reclaimed stock. Just make sure you verify before you pay, because several other dense tropical species get passed off under the same name. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. I started this journey staring at a block of wood sitting at the bottom of a bucket of water, thinking it was a parlor trick. But the more I learned, the more I realized that lignum vitae is one of the most extraordinary materials nature has ever produced. A wood that sinks, that lubricates itself, that rivals metal in hardness, that resists rot and saltwater almost indefinitely, and that quietly sat at the heart of every warship afloat and inside the clocks that changed navigation forever. Sometimes the most advanced engineering solution is not something you manufacture, it is something that grew. Thanks for sticking with me on this one. I will see you in the next video.